Welcome to Bell Cow Field Notes, a podcast that lives where pressing social or moral issues intersect with the literary world. I'm Rob Jung.
And I'm Mike MacBride. Together, we're Bell Cow Productions, the producer sponsor of the podcast. The subject of today's podcast is police ethics and fictional law enforcement. Rob, tell everyone who we have on our panel today.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Today, our guest cast of characters includes a retired police officer who teaches ethics to police cadets, and four authors, each of whom write books, and which a law enforcement officer is the primary character. First of all, Joe Moravchik. Joe, wave your hand so everybody knows who you are. There you go. Is a retired City of Racine, Wisconsin police officer with experience in patrol, field training of new officers, major crimes, and target enforcement. He was a multi-time recipient of the prestigious Exemplary Officer Award, ceremoniously presented by the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. Joe earned a law degree from William and Mitchell College of Law in Minneapolis. Joe, however, is a recovering lawyer. I would congratulate you on not taking up the practice of law. Instead, Joe has coached or administered youth and high school athletics, primarily girls hockey. He writes and hosts a radio podcast program titled College on the Radio, based in Northfield, Minnesota. And as I mentioned before, he teaches courses on ethics, constitutional law, search and seizure law, tactics, and criminology to police and state patrol cadets. Judy Kerr, hi Judy, writes the Sam C. McCall series featuring a female U.S. Postal Inspector as a protagonist. Third book in the series, Postmark Castle Cove, was released in July of 1925, and she's currently working on book 4. A number of Judy's short stories have also been published in various anthologies. She's a member of Mystery Writers of America and Sisters in Crime, and is currently serving on the board of directors for Twin Cities chapter of Sisters in Crime. And before her retirement, Judy spent 34 years? Did I get that right? With the U.S. Postal Service?
Yeah, right around there. Yeah, I
Okay.
have total of 38 years of federal service, a little bit with the IRS, and then I transferred to the Postal Service.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Tracy Clark. Hi, Tracy.
Wait.
Uh,
Quick
Tracy
point of
is
correction. You
oh
said
yeah.
1925 was when her book came out, but
Yes.
2025. 1925 would mean she had many more years of experience, but
So many more.
Just the first of many mistakes I'll make before this is over with. Tracy Clark, award-winning author of the Cass Raines Chicago Mystery Series and Detective Harriet Foster series. Her primary characters are or were Chicago Police Department detectives. Tracy's books have won numerous awards, including an Anthony Award, and she's twice been named the recipient of the prestigious Sue Grafton Award given to the author of the best female protagonist in a series. She's a member of Crime Writers of Color, Mystery Writers of America, Sisters in Crime, and sits on the board of directors of the Midwest Mystery Conference. She lives in Chicago, where she works as an editor for the Chicago Tribune. Did I get that last part right? Good.
Okay.
Good. Craig Johnson, New York Times bestselling author of the Walt Longmire Mystery Series, which is the basis for Longmire, the Netflix original drama that's won all kinds of television awards. Craig's books have won numerous awards, many of which I can't pronounce, but I'll give it a try anyway. Le Prix de Polar Nouvelle Observatoire Biblios,
Very good.
the Wyoming Historical Association's Book of the Year. That's the one I'll probably screw up. Le Prix 813, the Western Writers of America's Owen Wister Award, and multiple Spur Awards. The Mountains and Plains Book of the Year, the SNCF, I don't know what that is, Prix de Polar. Publishers Weekly Best Book of the Year, Library Journal's Best Mystery of the Year, and multiple Will Rogers Medallion Awards, and the Lariat Award. His Spirit of Steamboat was selected by the Wyoming State Library as the inaugural One Book Wyoming book. Craig lives in Ucross, Wyoming, population 26. Doug Dorow, by no means last, but Doug is a writing coach and myth thriller writer from Minneapolis, who is a graduate of the Minneapolis FBI Citizens Academy. He's penned his own FBI thrillers, a series with FBI Special Agent Jack Miller, and a spin-off FBI Hostage Rescue Team Critical Incident novella series. Doug lives in Minneapolis. Uh, Welcome, everyone. Everybody's website URL will be listed at the bottom of the podcast when we get this all done and wrapped up, so people will be able to check you out further and look at your books and hopefully buy them. But welcome, Michael. It's all
Yeah,
yours.
absolutely. Then they can dig in more and learn all about you and all your books that you have and find that kind of stuff as well. Joe, since you're kind of the backbone on which this panel rests, I'm really curious.
But
I'm really curious if you can give us like what does the kind of ethical training look like? Like what kind of things do you cover in there? What kind of things do you teach cadets that can kind of help inform our panel as we talk about how this plays out in fiction?
This is Joe as a police officer before retirement.
well, those are the weight room days. There is something to having that look and that physicality, because your body is important in that job. There are expectations when you go on calls that if somebody needs protection, you got to be able to do it. There are a lot of things to talk about with regarding to ethics, and we'll talk a lot about that today. But I always like to start with a few stories just to kind of give people an understanding of what it's like for police out there and how they develop the characteristics that they want to have to be ethical police officers. One of the stories I like to tell is, this is to groups of cadets, is this story about when I was a really young patrol officer and I was sent in the middle of the night to a domestic case. You go to a lot of domestic cases when you're in police work. Middle of the night, I'm sent with a partner. 911 hang up, a lot of yelling and screaming in the background. We get there and the apartment we're going to is backlit, so we can see everything we're gonna be walking into. And what we're seeing is a man just beating a woman, and then a young child kind of running around too. So we have to make a dynamic entry. That's kicking in a door and then putting somebody on the ground really fast. That's that guy who was attacking the woman. And then get the rescue squad rolling because he's injured. But then I look down and I've got that little child. He's attached to my leg. And I pick that little guy up and he looks at me and I look at him and he says, "Do you catch monsters?" And I say to him after a pause, I say, "Sometimes we got to catch monsters." And the thing about that night was, as a young patrol officer, is one of the things we have to do in this job is protect the least amongst us. And that is the example of that I try to teach the cadets. You're going to be walking into scenarios like that every day you're on a shift. And we protect the least amongst us. And part of that is the physicality job too. And what I talked about just to start, this idea is when you go to a call like that, there is an expectation that you bring that physicality, but then a moment or two later, you got to have that compassion for that child you got to pick up. So it's that balance, that hybrid officer that you want to teach human decency. Yeah, there's muscle on calls, but you better be able to figure out really quickly, you got to get back into that mode of compassion. And so that's an important thing to talk about. Second story I like to talk about is that first time I went to a medical examiner's office. I don't know if any of you have done that as part of your research when you're writing the thriller novels, but when you go to that medical examiner's office for the first time, you're on the main level and it's just water coolers and people talking about football and grabbing snacks from machines and typewriters. Well, not typewriters, but people typing out reports and such. And then you take that elevator down into the suites where they're doing autopsies, and it is a wake-up call to this undercurrent of violence that is truly in society that a lot of people just don't understand. We got coffee shops and jobs and great colleges and just lots and lots of wonderful people in the world, but there is an undercurrent of violence. And that particular case I went to was a man in his 50s who was just trying to make a little extra money for his family, delivering food at night. And somebody stuck a gun in his face and pulled the trigger, killing him. it was for 17 bucks in his pocket and a bag of Chinese food. That's what he got killed for. What do you learn from that? Undercurrent of violence. You better have people out there that are willing to take these people off the street. Again, the human decency thing, because you have to talk to a family about what happened. But I was thinking in that room when we were doing evidence for that case is just, I'm sorry that guy was on the table, but I thought to myself, we're going to bring justice to your family. And I think that's an important component too, just bringing justice to a family who has lost a loved one. That's another thing that police do. And let me just quickly do one more story. And I could do all kinds of stories, but people want to hear from you, not me. I go to a armed robbery, aggravated robbery. It's at a bank, but picture the drive-through of the bank. Somebody has just picked up their cash. They're kind of making their way through the bank drive-through. 17 or 18-year-old sticks a gun in that side of that person's car, robs them for that cash. But I'm in the area. It's called 1060. I am there. And as I'm kind of rolling through patrol, I hear what dispatch is telling me, and I can see this guy running with a gun from the scene. So I just kind of do my thing, order him to the ground at gunpoint. And then he drops the gun, thankfully, because I was about 15 feet away from him. And then I put him on the ground. And when you do something like that, you got to do it really quickly because people get hurt if the police don't know how to put people on the ground quickly in scenarios like this. But as I'm doing that, put the cuffs on quickly and it's a summer day and there are people on their porches and such. And a couple of people step out and they didn't see the robbery. But what they saw was the police officer throw somebody who's 17 down on the ground in kind of a hard way. So they started in with what'd you have to do that for? And, police brutality such. But I just said, just give me a minute. I'll talk to you. Just give me a minute. Let me wrap this up. Get more squads there, get him patted down properly, searched, and put in a wagon that we can take him to the county jail. But then I just stepped over and I talked to him about what happened before. I'm talking about the people that came off their porches. I talked to him about what happened before and why I had to do what I had to do. And a few of them were very, oh man, I didn't know that. I'm very grateful that you're out here. Whereas others still were locked in that mentality of what they saw, a police officer taking somebody down in kind of a hard way. And what that teaches you and what I try to teach the cadets is a lot of times people don't know what the police are doing. And what's important in a scenario like that is just go over and communicate with people. You have to be the muscle in that moment again, but then you have to be that decent person who just has a normal conversation with people and just get over to those people and say, hey, this is why I did it. And if you talk to them like we're talking here, it's that decency component. Most of the time people are going to understand, but not everybody is. So that's part of it. So I guess the hybrid officer, human decency, compassion, those are like foundational things that you have to have as a police officer. And if you're okay with me, I have not a long list, but I have about 10 things that I try to teach cadets throughout a 12 or 14 week case. And here they are. These are the great qualities of a police officer. I had to write them down, but it's honesty, it's work ethic, it's knowledge and appreciation of the law. They have to have that understanding. It's an interest in serving, listening, and treating everyone with dignity and respect. Oftentimes people just want to be listened to. It's ethical and decisive decision-making. It's emotional intelligence, which is about understanding your own emotions and how to control them in all these different scenarios you're going to be in, but also just kind of having an idea of all the things that you're going to see when you're out there, from mental illness to lots of lost people. They've lost their jobs or they're in a hard relationship or, they've got some level of mental illness. You got to have that emotional intelligence to understand who you're dealing with when you're going on calls. Developed and practiced defense and arrest tactics, strength and fitness, courage, problem-solving ability, compassion again, restraint and de-escalation, strength and fitness, if I didn't say that, but also the ability and desire to follow through. When I was a shift commander, there was two things that landed people in my office. One was if they were lazy, I wanted people to follow through. That's an expectation. But also another way, and I'm easygoing, I'm measured, but if somebody was treating the public badly for no reason than just to treat the public badly, laziness, and that kind of conduct would land you in my office again as a shift commander. And then lastly, sorry, I'm over talking here, but I really believe the badge is a symbol of faith and trust. And then secondly, I used to tell officers a lot, and I tell the cadets about now, is a lot of times police officers are the most visible members of a community. So you got to, every day, you got to have integrity. You have to represent yourself, your department, and your city with integrity. That's what I tried to live by, and that's what I try to teach the cadets. So that's where I'm at.
I don't know about you, but the line "Do you catch monsters?" is something that I was like, "Ooh, that's a good line for a book."
So the tendency, maybe that's not true, maybe not tendency, but it's common in the fictional world to idolize the character, the law enforcement character who sort of bends the rules, maybe skirts the issue in the in the name of morality or expediency. I'll just, since Michael Connolly's not here, I'll pick on him. Harry Bosch comes to mind immediately about someone who is always on the fringe, on the edge. Um, so talk a little bit. Let's just go around the horn, starting with you, Craig. Let's go around the horn and just give a little, have a little conversation about your primary character and how you view them ethically, and just in light of what Joe has just been talking about.
Well, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. Like, I guess the first one being that, like, being a being a sheriff is like a very particular style of law enforcement. And I'm always trying to explain overseas whenever I'm doing tours over there that sheriffs have to get elected, and they're all they're always appalled by that. They're like, "You mean they vote for who will be the highest law enforcement official in the county?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's the way it works, like in every state in the United States." And that kind of puts Walt in a unique kind of position in the sense that he's not only a police officer, he's also a politician. It puts him right out there in the forefront of, dealing, with a lot of things that maybe a lot of times, regular law enforcement don't have to deal with. And the way I saw that happen is that the guy that I, did a lot of ride-alongs with and spent a lot of time with developing Walt was a fellow by the name of Larry Kirkpatrick, who had been the sheriff in Johnson County here in Wyoming for so long he had pigeon shit on his shoulders from being a statue, for goodness sake, like that. And he was just a consummate, had an incredible ability to be able to talk with people. And that's why I was listening so carefully to what Joe was saying. But that ability to communicate becomes so essential, and that give and take becomes so essential like that, because people that will never walk into a police office, into a police department's office, like in their entire lives, will walk right into a sheriff's office, and pound on the counter and say, "I voted for you." Like, so, you got to come through with me here. Like, this guy's building a fence on my property and I want something done about this. And then the other things were, of course, like at the time when I was getting ready to put Walt together, here about 20 years ago, it seemed like everything in crime fiction was noirish. Everything was, alcoholic, divorced detectives burying bodies in their backyards, and I just thought, the people that I know in law enforcement are really incredible people that make a lot of like really massive, like, sacrifices in their personal lives, like, for the common good. And so I thought, okay, well, what if you did something different? What if you did like the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state? And of course, what that means is that, Walt was going to have to be held to a little bit of a higher standard whenever I was going to be writing about him. And that's for me, one of the joys, of what it is that I do. Whenever the producers of the television show, came to me and said they wanted to do Longmire as a television show, I literally looked at them and said, "Why?" I mean, how are you going to do this? I mean, how many people do you think we can kill in the least populated county in Wyoming before this is going to get kind of stupid? Like, and they said, "Well, you seem to have found a way around that for the last, 8 years. We hope that we will too." And to me, that was kind of one of the joys of it is that, I could take Walt out on that ragged edge of like, what's right and what's wrong. And that's also one of the major differences between what Joe was talking about and what a lot of us here in the panel are contending with. Like that, you get out on that raggedy edge of like ethics is not where you want to be in law enforcement. You don't want to be there because generally you're going to be deposed, and in court, is what you're going to be at that point in time. Whereas with what we do, that's where the good writing is. And that's where the really wonderful character development is where you can push that character of yours out there on that edge like that and see what they'll do in really questionable situations like that, whether it be, for the common good, or just as a question of good writing, to try and write a good novel like that. And so that's why I see that balance. That's why I'm very, very interested in, like what everybody has to say about that, because for me, that's where the red meat is as far as what it is that we do.
Doug, how about you? Let's talk to us about your characters and their ethical standards.
This is interesting because I'm working on finishing up a novel, and this is exactly where I'm at is questioning as he gets into the conflict, questioning his ethics. What would make him break his ethics? Because the officer I have, or the FBI agent I have, is a pretty ethical agent, and most of the people I've met are very ethical, and that's one reason they came into the FBI because of their beliefs and of law enforcement. But this story is exactly where I'm at, is what will he find as he's challenging himself to wrap this up and go against the antagonist, is where's that line and how close will he get to it where he might jump over and violate his own ethics. And like Joe talked about, how people reacted when they saw him take down those people. How will this guy react when nobody sees him, when he's by himself? There's two different scenarios, right? If he's out in the public and people see him, that's one thing. But when he's by himself, and it's just him trying to figure out what he would do to bring this to resolution, how far is he willing to go or not willing to go? So it's really fitting in as I'm trying to wrap up the current story I'm working on.
So we're going to have to get your book in order to find out what the answer to the question is, right?
Yeah.
What's the title of the book?
Empire Builder. It takes
Empire
place.
Builder.
So my main agent is going out into Williston, North Dakota, to the oil country, and working with the local tribal officer. So he's working on, he's not working on terrorism. He's back into kind of what the FBI did in the past, is just regular crime, and he's working on what's going on the reservation.
I've been to Williston. I don't think of empires as when I go to Williston.
That's the name of the Amtrak that goes through Williston.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, sure. I just rode the Empire Builder when I went down to visit Tracy at the Midwest Mystery Conference. Tracy, talk to us about your two protagonists and the ethical standards by which they operate.
Well, I everything that's been said is right. Well, we sort of meet it at a craft level. We have to sort of deal with tension and conflict and sort of division. So my characters have this sort of really solid individual morality. I've given them sort of this sort of shiny thing in the center of themselves where they have sort of stick to principle and they're honest and they have integrity and they have dignity. And they're up against a city that is sort of dubious in terms of, things happening. We've got corruption and stuff going on, and then my detective works for a department that, has its own organizational set of ethics, right? And so this constant back and forth between the personal morality, the organizational ethics, and the conflict that happens between the two of those things. That's basically my ball of wax right there. So I have my heroic characters. They're not superheroes. They're not perfect, but they have this foundation of I'm going to do the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. And then these opposing forces are there. How is that going to affect how I live my life? My PI and also my homicide detective, they have to sort of come up against that. How far will they go? The line that was mentioned. How far up to the line will they go? Will they go past the line? I don't think so. If they don't, why not? I have to explain all of that to the reader. but I'm always sort of working with these two things, these opposing things, the individual thing, the organizational ethics. How do they match? How do they sort of not match? How far apart can they get? So that's my thing. That's my whole engine. That's the whole engine running the whole books. I mean, that sort of conflict. But you've got to have characters who the readers sort of latch onto and believe in. They have to know that they're sort of good, mainly good, doing things for the right reasons. They might sort of get poked at on occasion, and then we have to figure out how far they go, where they go, how far will they sort of give in or not. And that's also interesting for me to write and also readers to read. So it's always conflict, tension, division. How far can I go? How over the line they can go? That's always it. That's it.
Judy, uh, let us in on MC McCall's ethical
Sure.
standards.
Sure. Well, one of the things I want to start with is like Tracy pointed out that there are ethical standards within the agency itself, and then obviously the personal ethics of the inspector. And for the inspection service, honesty, integrity, and reliability are pretty much the ethical standards for the agency. MC, she's definitely honest. She has integrity. The reliability, here's where in the first book, and I had this talk with a guy that's a resource for me with the Public Information Office for the Inspection Service, and he was a field inspector for a lot of his career, and he's read all my books. And so I put this question to him. In his opinion, having read the books, what where does MC stand ethically as an inspector and as a person? And he said his answer to me was that there's no ethical issue so much that she pushes. In the first book, she borders on insubordination with a supervisor in her field office because the guy does not like women inspectors, and he's pushing her. And so that's kind of a clash that she has with him, and it carries over, when with her friends and her family. She, gives voice to her problem with this guy at work. But obviously he doesn't like her, and he makes it tough for her. Whereas the other inspectors, he doesn't do this. Like he's almost like micromanaging every step. And she's a seasoned inspector. I mean, she's been there for 20 plus years. So it's like, why? And then another issue for her that comes into play is drinking. And that comes about because of something really horrible that happens in the first book. And she never drinks while on the job, never. But she does drink heavily outside of work. And so, as an inspector, I mean, she carries a firearm, right? And so that's an issue, even if she's not drinking on the job, right? Just to know that she could be carrying a firearm, and maybe she's not fully, sobered up and she's gone to work, right? Kind of thing. So there's that carrying a weapon, and then that puts her colleagues in the field at risk as well as herself. And we see a little bit of that in one of the books, and it comes into play. So, you know, she has in the first book and in part of the second a fellow inspector that does some covering for her when she's late and that kind of thing, and on a crime scene. So that I think in dealing and that's all specifically dealing with this horrible thing that happened in her personal life in the first book. So that situation morphs into this drinking that she's doing and then becoming less dependable, and then she gets focused on an investigation that is outside the purview of the inspection service. And she's doing that on her own after hours, sometimes during work. So there's that. To me, I want my character to be human, right? I want her to be believable. And as humans, we're all flawed. I don't know a perfect human. And so even though we're talking about law enforcement and I guess the brass tacks of it is we're all human and she's going to be flawed. She never causes, I mean, her behavior, she never causes anybody to be harmed. But she does get to a point where an intervention is needed. And, so she and her best buddy are the ones that clash over that until that's finally resolved.
Okay.
But she is definitely all about community, family, found family, and the victims of the crimes. She wants justice for the victims.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, you're right. It's so hard. And I think in our idealized society, we want our law enforcement agents to be perfect as well, right?
Yeah.
And forget that they have humanity and stresses outside of that also.
Yeah.
I'm curious about kind of a boring question, and well, maybe boring. I don't know. To go back to Joe, one of the things I'm wondering is, as somebody who served in law enforcement and teaches ethics to cadets, I'm wondering what kind of things did novels and TV get wrong? Maybe because they're too boring or slow. Like, I'm thinking the more I learn about any profession, the more boring it is on a day-to-day basis. And obviously fiction, film, whatever, it's a pressure cooker. We boil it down and distill it into this thing. But what are the things that you think, maybe procedural or any of these things, that would help with highlighting ethics in these kind of situations? Do these kind of film and TV shows kind of gloss over?
Well, first of all, I didn't watch police shows while I was a police officer. I mean, when you do the
That's
job,
probably good.
try to find other things, but I'm not, as we talked about before we started taping, I'm not allowed to watch police shows with my wife. She works at a hospital. She wants to come home and unwind. And if I'm sitting on the couch with her talking about tactics or any of that other stuff, she's just like, go away. I don't want to hear this. I just want my moment with whatever crime show she's watching. What I will say is I'm an avid reader. I love crime thrillers now. And what I like about the crime thrillers is I end every day with a book. What I like about the crime thrillers is the flawed characters. That's what I like. Human beings, as Judy said, are flawed. Police officers are flawed. They have lots of challenges that happen outside of the job. I mean, lots of high divorce rates, and there is alcoholism and terrible challenges like that. But what I really enjoy is the flawed characters that I read about in these flawed cities that they work in. The job, I became a police officer because I wanted that. I wanted to work outside. First of all, I kind of grew up on farms, working farm work and utilities and such, but I wanted a couple things. I wanted to protect the least amongst us. I grew up with a special needs sister, so I was always sensitive to that. I liked the idea of taking the worst amongst us off the street. I wanted to be a part of a team. Police work is exciting. It is, and it's dangerous, but there's downtime too. And when you have that downtime, I think what you were getting to is this idea is not everything's exciting. But during the downtime, you want to make that productive. So I did things like this. I wanted to stop in at the local charities, the people who were working with the homeless or feeding people every day. Why think about that? They're taking their free time to prepare meals and feed people who are down on their luck. but they also do it in very dangerous places a lot. So I wanted to be in there to say, hey, if you ever need me, here's my card. I'm going to be stopping in to say hi, make sure everybody's all right. So that's productive time when you're not doing aggravated burglaries or whatever. Another thing I did is I kept a football in my trunk. And on a down Saturday or Sunday morning, because athletics was something that was natural for me, I'd see a pack of kids on the street or in a park, and I'd get that football out and we'd run passing routes. And the reason for that was to make those connections. So they weren't getting in gangs and whatever else mischief they could possibly get into. And just have that positive connection with a police officer he's out throwing the football to everybody. One thing I liked about where I worked was we were one of the first departments in the country to embed social services with patrol officers. So on those scenes where somebody was having a mental health crisis or, those domestic things, or if it didn't get crazy where people were hitting each other and all that, and didn't have to be enforcement, we could make that scene safe and then let social services do what they are trained to do to try and provide all that problem-solving help that's really important for scenarios like that. And lastly, believe it or not, we had a book program. We had cops and kids fishing, but we also had a book program. We had a police officer who set up a bookstore, and we would keep books in our trunk. That doesn't always work with people. But it was just kind of neat to have the football and a book and just try to make those connections in a community policing type philosophy, which was what our department was all about. So I'm not kind of answered that in a roundabout way, but in those moments where there is downtime, you got to be productive. And a lot of that is communication with people, setting relationships.
I love that.
I have a question. All of our authors talked about, writing on the edge, writing on that ethical edge. That's where the tension is. That's where the excitement is. That's where books are written that people want to read. And does that on the edge mentality ever come up in your cadet training? I mean, do you try to keep them away from the edge, or do you try to train them to deal with being on the edge, I guess is the question.
So in addition to classroom, Robert, we put them in all kinds of different training scenarios where they have to, it's like real life stuff, simulations type stuff. Sometimes they have to use a gun. But what I try to do is teach this measured approach. Some of those cadets are just wired for action. And other ones they come with a good heart and compassion and all that, but they don't understand the physicality part of it. So as they're going through classroom and then all these scenario training type things, you got to teach people how to be measured. Get the ones that are too wired to come down and understand that, the physicality is great, but the best police officers are the ones that understand communication is most important, but you kind of train behind the scenes for those times where you have to use the physicality. You want it to be a last resort. Sometimes you just get out of the car and it's on, but a lot of times you can just de-escalate scenarios just by how you approach people. Simple things like talking to them like a normal conversation like we're having. Hey, I'm here to help. How can I help you today? Stuff like that matters. And then problem solving matters and trust. Okay, so let's bring the high wire guys down to that measured. Let's also get the ones that have that natural compassion but don't understand the physicality of it. Let's get them up to that place where they got to protect themselves. They are going to have a gun on their belt. They can't lose a fight, because if they lose a fight, then somebody can take that gun off their belt. And then it's not only a problem for that police officer, but it's the problem for everybody else in that area too. So there's that measured thing I'm talking about. That's the objective.
Okay. So, question for all our authors. Why do you think that our readers sort of idolize those people who bend the rules? Why is Harry Bosch popular? Why is Walt Longmire popular? why is, I mean, what is it about us that makes us drift in that direction? Doug, you look like you have an answer.
Well, I was thinking about that. I think it's not a reason, but you have the law enforcement ethical side versus the bad guys who are not ethical. So it's that battle between ethic and not ethical in many cases, I think. And so I think some people say, I want to see the good guys go against the bad guys with everything they've got, ethical or not ethical. So I think that's one reason is how can you almost even the playing field?
Okay.
I
Anybody
have to
else?
go back to like something that Judy and Joe were talking about before, as far as the actual, the mechanics of the writing and everything. There's a really great proverb like that we like people for their virtues, but we love them for their faults. An awful lot of the time, the
It's a
things
good
that are
line.
wrong with a character are what it is that draw you into, rooting for that character. I mean, if they're so perfect, then they're a comic book character is what they are at that point in time. And it's very hard to get a handle, on that type of character in so many ways. I don't know, Rob. Walt, he'll edge the rules a little bit, but he generally doesn't break the rules. He plays very fairly. I didn't get to it in that previous statement like that, but that was one of the things when I asked those producers, I said, why do you want to do a television show about this? And their statement to me was, we've kind of gone through this like anti-hero thing for the last, all the way since the 60s, for goodness sake. And they said, you know what, we're thinking that a lot of people are kind of getting a little bit tired of that, and Walt kind of strikes us as, really one of those like blue ribbon, by the book, always thinking about what's the right thing, kind of characters. And then it was interesting because then when they started developing the TV show, they took Wald in some areas that I never, would have, like, some interesting situations where he was, kind of ethically questionable and some of the things that he did. For me, the real tricky part, of course, is that it was fun listening to Joe talk about the ethics of the physicality of the job, like and then also the humanity of the job. And then there are two other aspects that I think are so essential. One's a sense of humor. I'm always appalled whenever I read crime fiction and there's no humor in the book because I always think to myself, okay, the only way you get through the day and with a job like this is by having a sense of humor. It's also one of the incredibly, attractive aspects, of the job like that, just simply because people understand that humor a lot more. Now, that's not saying that law enforcement doesn't have its own peculiarities as far as humor is concerned. Sometimes it can be extraordinarily dark, and a lot of people,
Hmm.
I remember a good buddy of mine who was a Texas sheriff. He one time said to me, he said, I used to think, that law enforcement had the darkest sense of humor. But then I was in enough hospitals and heard enough nurses talking, and I decided, no, we are a far second is what we are compared to the stuff that they talk about. Um,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah.
other one is intelligence, like that is trying to find a way to be smart. Where, you don't have to be as bad as the bad guys. You don't have to be as violent as the bad guys. Sometimes you can just be smarter than they are. That's always fun for me as far as the character is concerned. One of the I guess the example I can use is in Depth of Winter, there's a part where Walt finds himself in a situation where he's down in the drug cartel areas of northern Mexico. And it's not really law enforcement, it's a war, is what it is. And there's this one individual has this information, and he tried to kill Walt, but Walt's able to get him off of him. And they're in this abandoned village, like at an abandoned small town that has a bank, and one of the vaults down below, look at it, is one of the parts of the building that's still open. And Walt takes him down there, and has him handcuffed to a chair. And this guy's a hard case. Look at it. And he's like, he says, you can beat on me all you want. I'm not going to talk. And Walt's like, well, no, that's not really what I'm going to do. Look at it. He said, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And if you don't answer my questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk out of this vault and I'm just going to close that vault door. And these walls are about 3 feet thick. Like, and so, I don't know how long it's going to be before somebody's ever going to find you down here in the dark, but I want you to think about that for a few minutes before I walk out of here, and then just let me know what it is that you want to do. Like, well, obviously, the guy tells him everything he wants to know because nobody wants to be left in a situation like that. Well, would Walt have done it? I don't know. I don't think he would have like that, but just the fact that he was able to be enough of a threat like that to take him to a place where he wasn't just going to sit there and beat on him in a chair like that made it a little bit more interesting. And so for me, those are all facets I think that are fun to control like that within a novel and use.
Anybody else have any?
Yeah,
Judy?
I'll say this, from the craft perspective and the characters and their ethics and stuff. I'll go back to we're all flawed, right? So as a reader too, I want to read characters that are believable, right? And there's such a thing as getting things correct, procedurally, etc. Obviously, I'm not a law enforcement person and never have been, but I have resources that I bounce things off of, and I'll take those resources, information. But when I'm crafting my story, I want it. I take that information and fit it into the story to make it work for the story. So it's not necessarily going to be exactly what I was told, but it'll be believable enough that it works in the story and moves the story along. I mean, one of the great compliments that I've had in my very short stint as a writer, as a retired chief deputy from Stearns County, has read all three of my books. And he told me after reading the first two that he was surprised, pleasantly surprised, how much I got correct about law enforcement. And then after the third book, he sent me just a little message saying, "This is your best one yet. Keep at it." So I mean, you got to take all that research information, but again, you got to make it work for your story, for your characters, and I want it to be believable, and entertaining. There's, got, like somebody said earlier, you have to have humor. There has to be some form of humor too, because otherwise it's dry and, I don't want to read something like that.
So I'm curious, and you hedged to this, so it's a wonderful transition. I'm wondering, um, and I have a little bit of a wind up, but the question is essentially, as authors, do we owe the public or law enforcement any kind of debt to be honest about what they do? And like, does our depiction of their role in society, like as authors, do you ever feel guilt about showing illegal searches or, any of these things that are borderline unethical? And this is essentially why the question pops up is, I mean, it obviously fits into this thing, but the other day I was at the DMV or DVS or whatever Minnesota calls it here, and there was a sign that said organ donation. And it had all this information about organ donation. And then there was a big poster there that said, myth. I saw on TV that doctors won't save my life if I am an organ donor. Is this true? And then underneath it, it said, no, doctors are ethically charged to save their patient, and they can only harvest an organ after they have passed. So all I can imagine is there's like an episode of ER out there or something, right? Where this like colored the public's perspective. And so I'm wondering, like, as people who write law enforcement, do you ever think about like what the impact of that is? And how do you deal with that, I guess?
Mm.
And
Tracy,
Tracy, I don't know if you have thoughts. I hadn't heard from you, so I was going to call on you, but I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't have anything either. So,
Well, I think our obligation, first of all, is to tell a good story and to sort of serve the craft elements. That's number one. We're telling a story about characters, so we serve the story and the characters. Now, how we serve the department that we're writing about, I write about the Chicago Police Department, and it has a pretty interesting history. And what obligation do we have to sort of portray them correctly? I think we have a certain responsibility to do that. We don't want to sort of put it out there that something outrageous is happening when it's not. We don't want to denigrate the cops that we're writing about or the department that we're writing about. We want to sort of tell a truthful story, as close to truth as we can possibly get it. And what I usually do is I write something and I think it's okay story wise or craft wise or character wise. And I will run it by a police officer and say, well, is this probable? Could this happen? Does this happen? Is this something that happens in the department? And if they say no, that doesn't happen, that doesn't happen that way, then I will rewrite it to sort of make it more truthful. I don't want to put something out there that is just outrageously fantastical. But I will ask, and it's wonderful that you can have that opportunity to ask a cop, does this happen? Have you sort of encountered this situation? Have I gone too far here? Have I gone not far enough here? And they'll tell you, cops love to talk and we love to listen. So yeah, I will check always. I want to sort of be respectful and truthful and as close to reality as I can get it. But I also have to understand that it's fiction and it's story and it's character and whatever serves the story and makes it a better thing or raises the stakes just a little bit more. I'll try to do that. And then I'll check and make sure I didn't go too far. But yeah, you don't want to sort of put it out there that cops are all bad and blah, 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 blah. It's not the case. There are good cops out there. And in fact, the majority of them are absolutely fantastic. And, you know, so you want to make it as truthful as you can. You want it to sound right, smell right, sort of seem right. And then it's also fiction. So you have to serve that too.
So Tracy, well, maybe I can, put this to all the rest of you guys. Have you ever come across a comment or a review where somebody will say, there's a certain scene or whatever, something that happened in your book, and they're just like adamant, this would never happen in real life. This absolutely would never happen. I had a comment like that about, I can't remember which, if it was book 1 or 2. And interestingly enough, it was a scene where I used pretty much what really happened for an inspector. And I, put it, of course, I changed locations and tweaked it up a little bit, but it was basically what really happened. And this commenter is like, this would never happen. And I'm like, well, here's a really good example of truth is stranger than fiction, right? Because that was true, and you're telling me this would never happen. I mean, I didn't respond to the comment, but it was like, it was interesting.
Well, you get comments all the time, and I actually had the opposite happen. I've had cops sort of show up at my book signings and say, well, that's the most realistic that I've ever read in something, and that's good to hear because you sort of want to hear that because you don't want to sort of poo-poo on their job. I mean, they're doing a dangerous job that half that population would not take on a bet. They're doing something fantastically difficult, and you don't want to sort of just slap their faces with it. So, so I'm trying to get it as realistic as I can possibly get it. If I'm not unsure about it, I ask a cop. They will tell me if I've gone too far, and that's wonderful to have.
Yes.
But yeah, so yeah, I want it to be real, but I want it to be fiction, and I want it to be character. So, half and half, you sort of put it together. You do the best you can. You try to be respectful as you can, and that's it. That's it.
Yep.
There are 23 counties in Wyoming. And so I have 23 experts on what it is that I write about. And so if I do anything that's questionable or anything along those lines, those guys are right on me immediately with their emails, going, okay, look at, I don't know. I mean, a lot of times when you're talking about research aspects, and all the time, the question is not, you don't go to them with a scenario. An awful lot of the time, what it tends to be is more of how could this happen? This idea, this like twist or whatever it is that I have in this novel is so essential that I really have to have it. And so, what you have to do is approach the individuals who have that information and say, how could this possibly happen? Now, I'm going to take us a little because I have to do this just because it's really important to me as far as the conversation is concerned. Like that, we were talking about humor before, like that, and inevitably, whenever I'm teaching workshops, on writing like that, whenever like a student will say, like, well, how do you get people to like be drawn into your characters and be involved with the characters? I'm always like, give them a sense of humor. Give them a sense of humor. For guys' sake, who do you like hanging around with? You like hanging around with people that have a sense of humor, people make you laugh, right? And they're like, yeah. And inevitably, the next thing out of their mouth will be, yeah, but what if I'm not funny? And then you have to look at them and go, well, you're kind of screwed, aren't you? Like, you know, as far as that's concerned. And so now I'm going to turn that question a little bit for Joe, like that, and say, you know, because, you know, it's such a fluid thing, ethics, like that, you know, I mean, it can be rock solid and black and white, or, you know, you can get into those gray areas, like T.S. Eliot says, you know, all cats is gray in the dark. Like, and I guess, you know, the couple of things I'm looking at is like, you know, obviously, you know, environ versus genetics, like that, you know, I mean, you must have some students that come in and they've just got such a rock solid idea, you know, of what the ethics are, of what it is that they're doing. You know, you must like kind of sit back in your chair and go, okay, well, wow, this is pretty amazing. Like that they have this already. Like, because I'm a firm believer that, like, you know, as children, you know, parents, you know, that they give so much, you know, to their children, like that, as far as like assembling that framework that they have. And then there must be some other students, and you don't have to give us names or anything, but there have to be some other students that come into your class and go, oh my gosh, like that, okay, yeah, well, we got a lot of groundwork to do here, like that. And so I'd just be interested to hear, you know, about that dynamic from Joe.
Well, thanks, Greg. The first thing is, all right, so where did I get my ethics? It was my mom and dad. You just mentioned that, what the influence parents have was nothing they ever said. It was the lives they led. You know, how they interacted with community volunteering and how they interacted with a special needs sister. And my mom was 81 years old today and still teaching high school English. And I thought, I'm thinking about retiring. And then I'd look at my mom, I was like, okay, there's no retiring. She's 81. Well, I wanted to say, okay, so parents do that. But you're right. The departments hire these cadets. It's my job to teach them constitutional law and ethics and tactics and such. The only time I'll interfere with, you know, get a hold of a commander at a current department is if I think there's an ethical problem. Most of the things we can work out: tactics, compassion, report writing, law, learning all that. Most of you can work that stuff out. But if I've got a problem with what I think would be an ethical issue down the road, I'm going to get a hold of that department. I was a field training officer, and excuse me, this was a long time ago, but you take that job really seriously. Those field training officers will set that standard for officers really for the rest of their career. When I first got to the department, I wanted to emulate the best at the department. I wasn't a natural good police officer. I had to emulate the guys that did it well, the guys that understood physicality, the guys that understood communication, the guys that understood meticulous crime scene management, all of that type of stuff. But when I became an FTO, there was one time I came across a guy that I walked into my sergeant's office and I said, this guy has got to go. This guy has to go. And I told him the reasons why. It came down to ethics, communication, how he treated people, safety on calls. My sergeant says to me, he goes, Joe, we have paid too much for this guy and his training. Figure it out. Figure it out. So let's rotate him through that 6 months of training again. I told him, get rid of him, or somewhere down the road, the city's going to be paying. And sure enough, you know, it took 8 or 10 years or whatever it was, but, you know, he got himself into some ethical problem, and now the city's got to do a payout. That has changed a bit. That has, because now there's laws like duty to intercede, and departments are taking a much closer look at officers before they put them on the road. So ethics, as your question was about, is, boy, we got to work that out, or we need to get rid of them. Because all of us have seen enough where some police officer does something unethically, use of force or whatever, and then the city has to pay a great amount of money. That's taxpayers paying that. And on top of it, it's a trust issue. You know, police officers can do 1,000 things right, and then you see something on TV that's unethical because it's a use of force issue or whatever else, and that everything suffers because of that. But Craig, you were talking about dark humor earlier, and that is a part of the job. It is. I'm not going to use a real case, but I'm going to use something close. And I think you can see by what I've talked about how important being measured and dealing with the public and honesty and all that, integrity and that. But ambulance crews and ER doctors and nurses and police officers, they do have a dark sense of humor. They just do. That's how you deal with things. And I was a sergeant at the time. I was still major crime stuff. And I was just telling everybody, I was telling the whole group, listen, when we're going to those scenes, you cannot be goofing around. I don't want to hear a joke. I don't want to hear anything. Somebody has died there. Let's respect that. So I'm giving this ethical thing, and they're all kind of looking at me because I was like anybody else. I would jam up other officers and tease them and all that stuff. But now I'm in a role where I got to lead. So everybody got that? And they're like, we got you. We got you. Then the next day you go to a case like, somebody drowning in the sludge at the wastewater treatment facility or something, right? Which just leads to that natural humor. And then they're standing around you as you're giving them assignments, and they're like, can we say something here? This was a shitty way to die or whatever. We just had this conversation yesterday. None of that, as they're kind of doing their thing. So humor is a part of it. It just is. And it's a great part of the job as far as just kind of releasing the stress of it. So
I have a question that is for Joe, and we've talked. You've given us a broad brush, as this kind of a format would require, feeling for and understanding of how you teach ethics and what you teach. But there is out there in law enforcement a training process that is called the warrior mentality.
Mm.
It was used in the Minneapolis Police Department for a long time, and until not that recently, I think, have done away with it.
Mm-hmm.
But where does that, how does that fit in with being an ethical police or law enforcement officer?
So I didn't grow up in that warrior. What was it called? The warrior mentality.
Warrior mentality, yeah.
So, okay, think about the early 90s. You all remember the Rodney King thing, the beatings in Los Angeles. So I come in right after that. And the whole philosophy about policing was undergoing a change, and it was to community policing, building trust and partnerships within communities. So none of that warrior mentality was there as I was breaking in. But it's not to say that there, again, you saw the picture at the beginning of the broadcast, that police body you want to have because of the scenarios you have to get into. And part of what I did is I supplemented my police training. I was in kickboxing classes for preparing for those moments. I know a little bit about warrior mentality. I think it is extremely important to take care of your body as a police officer, it's not only a physical thing, but it's a mental thing. And it's also, think the cadets now, what they don't understand is they are going to be in scenarios where that heart is going to get moving really, really quickly. And part of taking care of yourself is taking care of your heart for the moments that stress level is going to be really, really high and that heart rate's going to be up. That's why you're doing that training. So warrior mentality, much different philosophy. We were communication first, trust building first. But again, it was that hybrid officer that understands compassion, but trains behind the scenes for those moments where you got to use the muscle.
Just thinking about the diversity of law enforcement that we have here on the panel in terms of characters and Joe's background, obviously, I'm wondering, like in terms of, I don't know, mystery, thriller, detective, procedural books, we have kind of a blurring of private investigators and reporters and sleuths and law enforcement and those kind of things. And I'm wondering, like, I don't know. Are there different? Do you think readers lump them all into one category? Because a private investigator, I assume, has a very different set of morals, that they have to operate in, legally or otherwise. I'm just kind of curious, like for the panel, um, you all actually write people in law enforcement, but where do you see the differences in those different professions that kind of fall under the same umbrella vaguely?
If you're using the amateur sleuth type character, obviously the biggest difference between a character like that and a procedural character like what we write is the amateur sleuth is not constrained by the code of ethics standards that our law enforcement characters are. Their own ethical standards, yes. And, so what are their ethical standards and what are they willing to do um, in the case of solving their mystery or crime or whatever. So I think that to me, that's the biggest. They don't have that. Maybe it's a constraint, I guess, of having to uh, follow the ethical code of conduct of agency or a department, right? So maybe that makes it easier for them. I don't know.
Anybody
Most of the
else?
private investigators that I know generally they say, "Yeah, you're just going to be taking pictures of people cheating on each other, like and that's basically what you're going to be doing for the rest of your career." So I always
Yeah.
laugh whenever I see these PIs like that, or out, working homicide cases or something like that. I'm like, well, that's kind of not in your purview, I don't think you're going to see that very often like that. And so I think it's a good point, like that obviously. Um, I mean, the big one there, of course, is like, are you being hired to do this, or is this a public service like that you're
Mhm.
providing, like with professionals involved in a job like that? And then it was interesting to hear kind of like what Joe was talking about as far as like departments are spread incredibly thin, in trying to do as much as they can, with the smallest amount of resources, the smallest staffs that they can have, like that, and writing about Wyoming sheriffs like that, that really, I mean, some of the counties in Wyoming are the size of Maryland, for goodness sake, like that. And then you've got these sheriff's departments, with just a handful of deputies like that have to respond to a lot of these situations. And, in those situations also, it kind of speaks a little bit to what he was talking about, the physicality is concerned, because you really, if you drive 40 miles at high speed to a domestic dispute with an armed individual, and you're not going to have any backup. There isn't going to be, if things go wrong, you're still very much on your own like that. And so, that creates a situation, that's fraught, with the opportunities of ethical questions of what it is you'll do and how you'll deal with those things. It's just a completely different brand, each type of law enforcement. I mean, I'd love to hear what Tracy has to say about it, because I mean, my gosh, in Chicago, like that, I mean, yeah, you're that's an army unto itself, there in like one of the largest cities in the state. Like, and I was trying to think earlier, Tracy, is vote early, vote often? Is that a Chicago phrase? Is that one of the
Yes,
Chicagoisms?
it
Like,
is.
okay, I just thought so. I just wanted to check on that. Like, make sure that was correct. So, so what are your thoughts on that? Curious.
Well, I've written both. I've written PI fiction and I've also write police procedurals. And I think PIs are more fun because they're sort of outsider characters, aren't they? They don't
Mm.
work for a department like Harriet does. They can sort of, be a little fast and loose with the law, depending on what kind of character they are. Cass is sort of a really ethical character. She is a former homicide detective, so she has that sort of propensity to want to serve and protect her community. And so that's her individual morality, that's her ethic. And so what happens, whatever she has to do to sort of get her client to feel whole or whatever case she's on, that's what she's going to do to a certain extent. She's going to make sure that justice is done. Now, how we define justice for her might be a little different than where the Harriet sees it. She works for a department. Actually represents the law. She cannot break it. But she still has to make things right for the people that she serves. So they've got the same motivation, different classes of, organization that they're working for.
Hmm.
Cass works for herself. She can pretty much do what she wants within a certain reason. But she wants to get things done. Harriet wants to get things done. Complicated city, bureaucracy, red tape, corruption, crime, and all of that perfect stew makes for good fiction, in my opinion. But yeah, they're sort of operating different levels of different ends of the line, but kind of doing the same thing for the same reasons. They're just sort of going about it a little different way.
I love the way you put that, Tracy. That was great.
I have Michael, I didn't mean to interrupt. You're about to say something.
Well, I was going to pose a closing question potentially, but if you had something else, go ahead.
Well, remarkably, you and I have lived together over bell cow so long that we're both thinking exactly the same thing. So I'm interested to hear what your closing question is as compared to what mine was going to be.
All right, then. We'll have
Wow, that was a quick
Yeah.
reverse in the
closing
backfield, wasn't it?
Yeah, really. Well, we said this was going to be unstructured.
Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of curious, like having had this conversation and heard what Joe had to say, how do you think your characters stack up on this kind of ethical, I don't know, continuum, I guess. And since Doug, you hadn't had a chance to chat in a while, I was gonna pick on you if you wanted to weigh in first, and I figured then everybody else could kind of talk briefly about theirs.
Doug, before you get started,
Yep.
it's interesting because that was exactly my question.
Oh,
It was exactly.
And
Oh,
we
that's
all
easy to
believe that.
say. Come
I was
on.
I was gonna put it slightly differently, and I was gonna say,
Close. Okay.
would your character or characters in Tracy's case, would your character pass or flunk Joe's ethical standards class?
I think my character, FBI agent Jack Miller, would pass the ethics class. And I think as we listen to Tracy's last answer, I think it's interesting as we think about all these characters, there's both sides, right? The ethics and the morality. And where does that fit for each individual within the ethics they might have in their profession, but then their own personal morals as well. So it's interesting.
Tracy,
Well,
pass or fail?
I think my characters both would stack up pretty well. But my job as the writer, serving the reader, is to take that nice shiny thing, that ethical person, and poke at the armor continuously, make little dents in it to see just how far I can get away with it. Okay, so that's my job as the writer. I'm taking this shiny thing and trying to make it not so shiny, and to make it as complicated for that shiny thing as I can possibly make it, and to sort of pick at that ethic and that personal morality and push them over the line as far as I can push them and see how much resistance I get. So that's what I do on a daily basis at 5:30 in the morning when I get up to write. That's what I'm always thinking about in terms of character, not only protagonist, but antagonist. How far can I push them? How far can I get them beyond their comfort zone? And how complicated can I make this thing? So, shiny, yes, but I'm trying to make it as unshiny as I can possibly make it, and as dent that armor as much as I can dent it, and then see what I end up with.
I love that. Even in your description there, I'm picturing a badge, right, with lots of little dents in it. So well
Absolutely.
done. Very, very nice visual.
That's
What about you,
awesome.
Judy?
I don't know how I can possibly follow Tracy on this, but no, I think MC would pass the ethics training. But again, to parrot Tracy, I want MC to be challenged, right? As the writer, I want challenges for every scene, every book, I want her to be challenged, not only professionally, but personally, right? And find the worst of the worst for her to go up against and see, who comes out on top in those instances, or if anybody does, right? So, I mean, yeah, again, for me, I want the story to be believable. The situations molded to make the story keep moving along and bring the reader in. I want them to be in and connecting with the characters.
Cool. Craig, bring us
And
home.
okay, yeah.
I think that Walt would do very well in Joe's class. I think Joe would be appalled at the lack of scientific knowledge the world has. But other than that, I think ethically he would probably do pretty well. One thing just to touch base on really quickly too, also is that whenever you're talking about different cultures, whenever you're talking about different genders, different age ranges, all these different things, it was interesting for me to hear what Judy was saying as far as this investigator that's got like 20 some odd years of experience, being micromanaged, by, a higher up like that. I mean, and a lot of times I think a lot of female officers, they do face a lot of that type of thing. I mean, one of the characters that got in the books, Victoria Moretti, who's Walt's undersheriff, is actually a transplant from Philadelphia, which is the only city that might give Chicago a run for money as far as like, that kind of thing is concerned. Vote early and vote often. But I mean, she's got four brothers that are, they're street duty officers in Philadelphia. Her father is the chief of detectives, for Philadelphia North. She's had to be twice as smart, twice as capable, and all these things to be noticed half as much. Like it. And then, of course, there's the fact that Absaroka County on the border of Wyoming and Montana is right beneath the Northern Cheyenne and the Crow Reservation. Like it. And so we've got another entire, sovereign nations like at unto themselves with their own police forces, their own courts, like at and all of these things like it. And so I think, that, what's the ethical, concourse, for one group of individuals is not, for another group of individuals like it. And so you have to be able to find a way, to adjust that a little bit, I think. And that's another one of the points I think that makes it interesting to do what it is that we do for a living.
I want to do one just to make one comment before I ask Joe to weigh in as on the final issue or the final question. I write a character who's a villain with an ethical streak. My favorite character to write, and to match this international crime figure's ethical standards with the ethical standards of law enforcement is a very interesting process. So, having said that, Joe, you're a reader, you're a radio personality, you're a retired policeman, you teach ethics, you're somewhat of a iconic figure in girls hockey in the state of Minnesota. So having said all that, wrap this up with what your thoughts are about our panelists' characters and your ethical police officer background. What do you think? Would you give them passing grades?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I talk too much. I'm really happy to be a part of this, but I have authors to track down now. I have books to read. I can't wait to do that. I can't wait when I start reading to really get a feel for their characters and how their ethics are and how they're stretching the line on the ethics. Again, now that I'm retired, outside of really caring deeply about training the new cadets, again, I just like going and reading the flawed characters, just the ones that are really on that line or across that line. But as far as like summarizing today, write those characters that are on the line and crossing it, because I think that just makes for good reading. And let me figure out how to train the real cadets, how to make sure they're within those lines that the police or society expects from the police. That idea of trust and integrity being that foundation for really what the community should expect from their police officers. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a short summary, but I'm a fan of all of you. That's what I want to say as writers.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed this morning's podcast. I hope that all our viewers and listeners have enjoyed it as well. We thought of this and of bringing you all together for the very reason that the literary community and the real world intersect over some of these flashpoint things This one being particularly poignant in light of the recent history in Minnesota for those of us who live here. And I think you've all done a marvelous job. So applause to all of you. Thank you very much for being with us. Yeah,
Thank you,
likewise.
everybody.
Thank you. You guys have a great
Thank
weekend.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.